Presenting now.
That's a good idea. Yes, yes.
I mean, the problem is that would be too late for her.
No, it's not. She, and so I have to apologize. I didn't take account of change in time. It is in fact, Delhi is in fact 1 hour behind the time I thought it was.
I see, yes.
So what I thought was 7 o'clock was not 7 o'clock. So sorry, it's now 6.
It's about 6, so.
Can someone just check the time in Delhi?
Yes.
So we can get this right. Time in Delhi currently
6:20.
6:20, and the time here is 13:48.
Mhm.
So
you've got 40 minutes.
so you've got 40 minutes, Emma.
I'm going to go to Lou.
It's your time you're wasting.
I was waiting for the break to do that.
I'm really
Just
sorry.
1 second.
Yeah.
See that you raised was a time. I think now maybe. According to Heidegger, everything is about time.
Yep. In this case it is.
Yeah. Yeah, true. It's just we have.
There's a very chatting and this is working in physics. Says the five.
I'm really sorry.
It's better than this.
Yeah.
In both of them, he says. Yes, but this is, but he knows what he's talking about because he's really. Yeah, but that's not his.
Going to start join us just before 7 her time, which is 2:30.
That way.
So your presentation might be slightly shorter than the others.
And that's really shame.
I'm really sorry. Okay, colleagues, we're going to, my apologies to Herman. We're going to have Herman present before Prathama joins us. Herman is a colleague here. He's working on the project about the cartography of the political novel. And he'll be presenting today some of the conceptual work that goes into how Herman's thinking about the political. and what the implications of that are, I hope we will talk about afterwards for how we conceptualize the novel. So Herman, welcome and apologies.
That's absolutely fine, Mark. I do want to start with some apologies as well. I wouldn't call an iteration of this paper, but I sat here the same paper 2 weeks ago. This is the first time I'm doing this. It's been brutally hectic. So apologies to colleagues who have heard a version of this. I want to start with 2 points. Speaking about the London riots of 2011 that followed the shooting of black man, Mark Deegan, Simon Bauman said, "These are no hunger or bread riots. These are riots of defective and disqualified consumers." And this description of riots fits Badiou's assumption that global revolts and riots are not yet a coherent force. Immanent riots, he asserts, are, and I quote, blind, naive, scattered, and lacking a powerful concept of durable organization, end of quote. If riots are to signal, he says, a reawakening of history, they must indeed accord with an idea, which is why Badiou also calls into question, and I quote, the corruption of popular subjectivity which they manifest, and describe them adversely as profitable stealing. Only what Badiou calls historical riots have the potential to be pre-political, not even political, but pre-political. So that's the first point. Second, Adorno repeated repudiation of jazz as black music, but also his denial of the claim that jazz music involved any genuine improvisation and kind of process of spontaneity. His assertion that jazz music never introduced important new technical means into music, and his description of jazz as, and I quote, mere emasculation music in his 1933 essay, Farewell to Jazz, are symptomatic of a mass deeper problem that Hobsbawm's portrayal of Adorno's essay on jazz, as some of the stupid pages ever written about jazz, is able to disclose. Surely, these essays might be stupid, and as Robert Wittgen suggests, possibly racist. But they also signal the failure, a failure of intelligibility of the so-called critical tradition of Western thought to touch, to listen, to make visible, or to grasp in its invisibility Black social life as improvisation, as improper, and as fugitive. For Adorno, the defining characteristic of jazz as emasculation is that, and I quote, it lacked any true dialectical development in its internal relations, end of quote. We can say that for Adorno then, jazz is anti-dialectical noise, and therefore nonsensical, and hence non-political. But what is that's how precisely Black study has attempted to theorize Blackness. For Debbie William Hart, Blackness is a sound that is irreducible to speech. Blackness is a noise that refuses accountability and translation into reasoned speech. It refuses to be intelligible for the epistemic ears of the critical tradition and of the slaveholder. It is black noise. Now, this irreducible sound of blackness, this black noise, also suspends the dialectical process. Remember that for Hegel, and I follow Kojève here, only the slave can transform the word that fixed him and that formed him and fixed him in slavery, and create a word that he has formed in which he will be free. And the slave achieved this only through forced and terrified work carried out in the service of the master. To be sure, this work by itself does not free him. But in transforming the word by his work, the slave transformed himself too, and thus create new objective conditions that permit him to take up once again his liberating fight for recognition that he recused at the beginning of history for fear of death. This slave is also freely a he, a masculine hero. Black noise, however, black social life is fugitive. Just as black jazz, fugitivity, does not care for recognition. It doesn't aim to get back to Adorno for a dialectical development in its internal relations. Doing so would be to leave untouched the structures of differentiation that had privileged work, negativity, and death as the foundation of history in the first place. So black noise, unlike the figure of the slave in Hegel, renders inoperative the struggle for recognition, and in so doing suspend the dialectical process of history. Blackness, jazz, blackness as fugitivity, suspend the very coordinates within which suspension itself takes place. It calls into question strategies of interruption that take the form of constituent power, of revolution, of the event. It reminds political ontologists like Badiou that they cannot be friends with God, as Plato would have wanted, to sanction what counts as properly political. So what I will do in this paper is to create a space in the oscillation between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism to think of Black noise as a form of generative Blackness with Fred Moten, and to argue for a fugitive ontology that escapes the polity of recognition as a way to think about politics and the political. The caveat here, and I refer back to Alan's presentation yesterday, is that the expression fugitive ontology is obviously an oxymoron. Ontology is the operation of establishing proper boundaries, and as such, is an operation of violence. So we'll speak of fugitive ontology as a provocation, or to follow Judith Butler, as an insurrection at the level of ontology. My working hypothesis is that the notion of politics of sociality that emerges out of Moten's critique of Afro-pessimism disturbs the ontological apparatus and adds a different tonality to debates around politics and the political. So I will start first with a brief description of Afro-pessimism. According to Afro-pessimism, Blackness is a structural position produced through gratuitous violence, that is, violence without formal transgression. Black people are integral to human society, but at all times and in all places excluded from it. Blackness is a slavery, and for Frank Wilderson, the state of slavery for Black people is permanent. And he says, every Black person is always a slave, and therefore a perpetual corpse, buried beneath the war and is thinking it up, end of quote. Since these structures are ontological, they cannot be resolved. There is no way of changing this unless the world as we know it comes to an end. This is why the Afro-pessimist relational schema, the fundamental inclusive exclusion, to go back to a Ricardo presentation, would be seen as the only true antagonism. For Afro-pessimism, all the repressive relations, like gender, like class, would take place at the level of conflict, but not at the level of ontology, and hence they can be resolved. This is why, for Wilderson, Orlando Patterson's account of social death is still at the center of Blackness in the afterlife of the plantation regime. And not just at the center, social death and Blackness fully coincide and cannot be thought of independently of one another. The spectacle of Black death is essential to the mental health of the world, writes Wilderson. Coinciding with Membe, for whom Blackness is the nuclear power plant from which the project of knowledge and governance have been deployed. Social death functions through a brutal genocidal violence that ensures that racialized bodies are unable to achieve recognition as subjects. Human society is constituted through anti-Blackness, and therefore the notion of Blackness cannot be accommodated within the notion of the human, let alone the legal subject of rights. Now, it is against this ontological political conflation of Blackness and social death, of Blackness as social death, that Moten develops his account of Black optimism, or Black operation. Now, the difference between these two modalities of Black study is as essential as it is difficult to grasp. Yet, I argue this oscillation, the oscillation between Blackness as social death and Blackness as social life, provide means to think about politics and the political. As Moten presented, the difference can be traced back to two different conflicting interpretations of Frantz Fanon's phenomenology of Blackness, and divergent readings of Fanon's account of the lived experience of the Black man. Indeed, and I quote here, in criticizing Fanon, Moten speaks directly to Afro-pessimists when he denies that Black social life, what he also called stolen life, is absolutely reducible to social death. Hence, and William David suggests, Moten rejects the notion that Blackness as artifact of is an artifact of whiteness without reminder. For Moten, Blackness exceeds imposition and negation, just as Black people are not reducible to a pure absence. What Afro-pessimists like Jar Sexton and Wilderson ignore, for Moten, is a fugitive moment of escape within Fanon's account against this pathological construction. By pathologizing Blackness, Fanon fails, and I quote Moten here, to claim an irredeemable homelessness common to the colonized, the enslaved, and the enclosed. It is claimed what Blackness names, a common disorder that has always been there, that is retrospectively and retroactively located there, that is embraced by the ones who stay there while living somewhere else, end of quote. When we cut through this disavowal, we can start to think of Blackness as fugitive. We can start to touch the sound of jazz. So George Sexton argues against Moten, however, that nothing in Afro-pessimism denies or ignores these fugitive moments of escape that are central to Blackness. For Sexton, and I quote, Black social life is lived in social death. Black optimism is always already a constitutive element of Black social life, but lived in social death. So for Sexton, then, the problem and the distinction between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism lies elsewhere. Whereas Black optimism construes the fugitive moment of escape as an escape from social death, Afro-pessimists see these moments among the different ways in which social death is lived. So there is no performative escape from social death. In the surreptitious gatherings of the enslaved recuperated from the archive of the Black critical radicalism by Sadiya Harman, Sexton and Frank Wilderson would only see different ways in which Black social life unfolds through social death. Such gathering, writes Sexton, are always haunted by a sense that violence and captivity are the grammar and ghost of our very gesture. This is where performance meets ontology. In my view, what is at stake here is the anti-ontological character of improvisation. So whether or not improper, the fugitive character of Black social life can be thought of without a determinate relation to social death. In this oscillation between social death and Black social life, Afro-pessimism would understand improvisation as fundamentally and categorically constrained, whereas Black optimism urges to see improvisation as a refusal of the necessity in which it emerges. This is why Moten does not define Blackness in terms of a failed struggle for recognition, but rather the refusal of what has been refused to Black people. The interdiction of Blackness cannot prevent Blacks from rejecting what they have been denied, namely civil status and ultimately transcendental subjectivity, a refusal of the politics of recognition. This is why the performative moment of Black social life par excellence is not, and I think against Butler reading of Arendt, is not the right to have rights, but the right to refuse rights, to refuse the terms on which they're offered or the terms in which they have to be claimed or assumed. So we have therefore arrived, I think, at the crux of the problem. The distinction between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism is not that the former does not pay critical attention to fugitivity and improvisation. The distinction is more subtle than that. Afro-pessimism understands these moments, spaces, as necessarily linked and determined by Black social death, whereas Black optimism understands fugitivity as improper, as a refusal of the relation that ties together Black people and Blackness when understood as social death. Now, I want to conclude with by offering a number of propositions about the way in which the debate between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism open new lines of interrogation for our understanding of politics. And we present this, I suppose, in the disguise as questions, but and some of them have already kind of been mentioned in the presentations yesterday and today. But I hope that we kind of help us to tease out some of the possible and actual relevance of fugitivity as a way to think about politics. So the first point is improvisation and I suppose the ontological apparatus of the individual. So when seen in this light, fugitivity also augments and intensifies the problems with accounts of relationality that still hold on to the notion of the human. If Blackness, either a social death or a Black social life, or a complicated tension between the two, demonstrate the radical incompatibility between the human and the Black man, then it follows that we can conceive of a political ontology that privileges the human face of the other or the notion of agency, no matter how relational or insurrectional it may be. In this sense, the notion of fugitivity is predicated upon the deactivation of the ontological apparatus of the individual. In the oscillation between social death and Black social life, we find means to think anew relationality in true model terms, escaping the aporias of the ontological apparatus. What is at the stake is the decisive metaphysical problem of the ontological difference between beings and beings, between substance and its modes. A fugitive understanding of relationality and of politics would resolve this ambiguity by thinking the relation between social death and Black social life, neither in terms of identity nor in terms of difference, but rather in terms of a radical improvisation that shows that Blackness is not a substance that precedes the forms it takes in social life, but that it constitutes itself in this very process of modification and sociality. To put it differently, Blackness is nothing other than its modifications in social life. These are, I argue, shed light on the contingent and anti-ontological character of relationality. Against the grain of the self-possessive individual, and to steal from Motten's book Stolen Life, against the grain, and I quote, of the man's brutal self-projections, which often result in the addictive tendency of his others to settle for the settler's delusional sovereignty, Blackness has still the fugitive, radical, imaginative, socio-poetic work of refusal to do. This work takes form in passage as illogistics and logisticalities of sharing, as a general indebtedness that requires and allows a general corporate liquidation performed by means of what Gisons calls consent not to be a single being. Furthermore, for Motten, the first and most serious crime is Black sociality, and therefore Blackness is always improper. According to Motten, this crime is ultimately rooted in Black maternity. But unlike Cabaretto maternalism, which struck me as a pure type, here what we have is, and I quote, a tremendous convergence between phonic materiality and maternity. So to think of fugitivity as a paradigm of politics then means to wrestle with the anti-ontological tonality of the improper, but also with its relation to property and materiality, a relation that violently passes through the Black female body. For Motten, fugitivity is a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. To quote a passage from Motten's Stolen Life that captures this very well, and I quote, so if the nightmare of normative kindship is always already invaded by property, then Black kindship remains fantastically to claim the bridge that is imposed on it, and when Blackness is conceived as property without property. In other words, we claim the monstrosity of being property without property, so that we can bring the disruption noise of the improper to bear in and on and out of the world. This means that if we are to think of fugitivity as a way to think about politics from scratch, and beyond the insufficiencies of political ontology, we also need to give an account of property, and I obviously follow Mark Devane here. How our account of relationality accounts for the commodity that it speaks. The figure of the fugitive slave who is stealing herself and expropriate, and in stealing herself expropriate the expropriator. Here, to go back to David William Hart, if fugitivity steals her life, then Blackness is thief. It is, to play with Badiou, profitable stealing. So how to accommodate these fugitive relations that simultaneously denounce, deconstruct, and deactivate property within the so-called relational turn in political ontology? I also wonder, and this is an honest question, what does it mean for the analysis of vulnerability, which is kind of central in discussions about post-foundational ethics and politics. Can the notion of vulnerability as the point of departure for relational ontology do justice to Black social death? Is Butler's distinction between precarity and precariousness enough to account for Black social death, or is she one step too late in her recognition of the existence of a differential allocation of precarity? I'm almost done. Now I would like to bring to our discussions about politics and the political harmonies, questions about the place and role of Black women in our understanding of politics. This is a wonderful quotation, and I'm sorry it's a bit too long, but with that I want to close. Speaking about enslaved women, she says, where does the impossible domestic work fit into politics? What is the text of her insurgency and the gender of her refusal? What visions of a future world encourage her to run or prepare her flight? Certainly, we know that enslaved women fled the plantation, poisoned slaveholders, plotted resistance, dream of destroying the master and his house, utilize abortifacients rather than reproduce as slaves, practice infanticide rather than sentence their children to social death, to the auction block, to the master's bed, exercise autonomy in suicidal acts, gave birth to children as testament of an abiding knowledge of freedom contrary to every empirical index of the plantation, and yearn for radically different ways of being in the world. So where does exactly the sex-trudge, recalcitrant domestic broken mother or hostile wet nurse fit into schemes of politics? How does the character of the slave females' refusal augment the text of Black radicalism? Is it at all possible to imagine her as the paradigmatic slave or as the representative Black worker? So I don't have time now for accounts of politics and the political that fail to capture these practices. That's a provocation, but it's also a question. Finally, if we're going to rethink the category of the political from the perspective of Black optimism, then, and I quote Moten here, what is required is an improvisation of singularity, one that allows us to reconfigure what is given beneath, outside the distinction between elements of the structure and its total forms. So we need to think of politics in ways that avoid the aporias of the Hegelian mediation between the universal and the particular. Remember that Hegel himself thought that the mediation required a police force to police the excess, the rabble. And here, again, the grain of Adorno dismissal of jazz, and to put Moten in the break, jazz allow us to think of a tonality and the structure of harmony as it moves in the oscillation between voice and voicing, not in the interest of any numerical determination, nor in the interest of any ethical temporal determination, but for a kind of decentralization of organization of the music, a restructuring, or if you will, a reconstruction. So jazz is the refusal to attempt a return to the source. Thanks. I'm too tired, so I was rushing.
Right. So we've still got some time before Prathama joins us at 2:30. So I'm going to open up to questions. First, is there anybody online who'd like to ask some questions? Are there any in the room? I see behind me. Seraphin.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the talk. If I understood your central claim correct, you're suggesting that Blackness is nothing more than improvisation in social life, and Blackness means basically having no place in a racist, white-centric social life, and so we end up with this necessity to improvise. And given that you began your talk by talking about riots and the inability of hegemonic political discourse to understand these riots, should we then understand these riots as political improvisation of those who have no place in the political order? So this would be my first question, and maybe following up on this, Slavoj Žižek's opinion on riots and especially looting in the context of these riots is that these riots are not revolutionary not because they are violent, because Žižek accepts violence as a means, but because these riots remain often within the ideology of neoliberal capitalism. It's about gaining access to consumer goods by any means necessary in the face of a society that would normally shut off certain people from this dream of abundance and of the consumer society. So maybe my two questions would be, on the one hand, what's the connection between improvisation and riots? Did I get this right? And the other point would be, what do you think about Žižek's position?
Thank you. That's a great question. Let me start with the second, with Žižek, if I may. Yes. So Bauman, Žižek, but you sort of all responded to 2011, kind of all in the same page. This is not how it should happen. This is not the revolution. So I think Žižek's analysis of riots is based on, I would say, 16th, 17th century, where obviously the riots are about setting the price of market goods. It's about the price of bread, and as opposed to strikes that are about setting the salaries. Now, in this kind of history of riots that you get in people like Joshua Clover, you have the idea that riots were prominent when circulation and capitalism were prominent. Then we go to strikes in the process of industrialization. But then, interestingly, there is another step that I think Žižek completely missed, and it's that riots from the 70s onwards start when a black man is shot, Los Angeles, for instance. And I think there is an element of that is totally missed by Zizek about the connection between police brutality, blackness, and rioting. I think it's not just, it's completely kind of, it's missing the point. There are very kind of good accounts of these. There is a notion of riot prime, for instance, that allows to capture how riots today have nothing, well, not nothing to do, but are primarily driven by a racial element that all of those thinkers had ignored. Now, the question of violence is a good one, because they all also talk about riots being violent. Some of them celebrate the violence, some reject the violence. But the riot is only violent if you live, like myself, in Hove. So I can look at that from the outside and say that's violence. But for those involved in the rioting, life is structured the everyday life. So there is not such a distinction between the kind of spectacular sensation of violence in the riot and their everyday life. So to say that riots are violent is already ignoring the fact that violence structures the everyday life of pretty much, and not just kind of explicit violence, the violence of loan shark, is that how you call them in English? People who, all of those forms of violence. So to say that a riot is primarily characterized by violence is already to speak from a position of privilege, whereby your life is not structured as violence, and you can say, oh, that's violent, if that makes sense. So that's the first question, but I want to know your thoughts on that. And the second, I wouldn't say that these are politics of improvisation. I would say politics is improvisation, which means it's not just radical contingency, but it's also a self-awareness of the radical contingency. I don't know if that helps. Thanks.
Alan next, and then Herman, can you manage the questions? I just
Yes,
want to go to the
yes,
master quickly before we start.
Well, thank you, Herman. I must admit this is literature that I'm not familiar with, so my questions might be slightly odd. But I was thinking that the way that I heard the debates about blackness, I was thinking this this search for the beyond. I don't know if you can follow. So there is, and this is it's also what I was trying to hint at with this, to say that in antagonism you can actually see the beyond, so to say, and I'm very skeptical of that. So no matter how marginalized, no matter how much on the fringe, no matter how enslaved or whatever, it's still not really beyond. It's always already within. So this would be my first question. If you can see that debate in this debate on blackness that you were referring to. The second is I really this idea of improvisation. I think that's very productive, and because because I get your point that politics is improvisation, but the question is, of course, what does it take for us to accept this improvisation, right? So when do we actually? I guess there's an element of newness. There's an element of non-reproduction involved in it. And this is what Adorno, for some bizarre reason, couldn't see in jazz, which is odd. But anyway, so the question is, how do we think? I was going to say what criteria, but it's not really what I mean. But how do we think this strange dialectic between newness and reproduction? Because in improvisation, obviously both is present there. We need to know the melody, we need to know the scales and things like that to move outside it. So there is this doubleness of reproduction and newness involved. And so when would we say that something is improvisation? When does the newness, so to say, be sufficient? And so when is it politics would be the translation, I presume. Mm-hmm. And when is it reproduction? Yeah, just some thoughts for reflection. Yeah.
Let's maybe take you. I don't know how long we have. So maybe I should take your question as well at the same time, and then. Is that the keynote?
Yes, that is the keynote.
Shall then just respond to you, Alan, and then. Mari, we start. You said
We'll start at, where are we now? We'll start in 9 minutes' time.
okay. So I do have
Prathama,
to-
welcome. We're just finishing off the session with Herman, and then we'll start at 2:30 our time with you. Greg, I'm really glad you could join us because other people have struggled.
Hello. I didn't mean to interrupt. Please carry on.
Thanks. Yes. So the question of the beyond antagonism. I think that's the fundamental question of the debate between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism. It doesn't take the form of the beyond. It takes the shape of the excess, trying to understand the excess, which I suppose is a very similar question, and the ontological character of the excess. I think that's the central question. I'm already on one side of the equation. I do want to work on, if you wish, the anti-ontological character of the excess, that we can never ontologize it. So that's the first point. Now, your second question about improvisation, I think that's precisely I think that's where I lose people like Oliver Marshall. Like that's like, I think he's, even though this comes from a different tradition, I follow pretty much all the steps until that final point where he wants to translate this into a form of politics, and then he end up with this minimum, minimum political, this set of criteria. What I want to do is to get back to the notion of noise, is to avoid the temptation of translation.
Of what?
Translation, to translate noise into speech, or basically to translate these practices as, there is no mediation, basically. I just want to take them face value and pay attention to these practices as they emerged. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yeah.
I suppose you disagree with.
No. I think I can, if I may, I can follow what you want to do, but I think there is a problem there because aren't we doomed to translation, so to say? That's a tricky thing about excess and beyond. We desperately want to deal with it, but as soon as we deal with it, it's no longer beyond or excess or whatever. So there's always an element of translation. So it's not, to me at least, it wouldn't be a question of avoiding translating, but trying as hard as possible to translate in accordance what we believe is the logic of what we're trying to translate or make sensible to us.
Which is a great question, because then it takes us back to the question that underpins this workshop, which is the relationship between literature and political theory or politics. And I think there is something to say about poetry and literature, that they capture lived experience without precisely that element of translation that political theory is always sort of driven to.
They translate in another way, which can be extremely productive, but I would say it's still translation of some sort.
We have time for one more question, which is Owen. Owen, I'm going to ask you to be concise in the question, if that's possible, because then we can get into the keynote.
Okay. My question is kind of just an echoing in a way of Seraphim's question, but from the Jews rather than Jewish perspective. I suppose it comes down to because that part about the historical rights, I don't think you mentioned that, or maybe you mentioned it briefly in your previous version, but the Jew is explicit about the fact that those rights usually begin with the shooting of a black man, and I was also living in Hove watching, and I agree completely with what you said about the structuring of violence, as seeing it from an outsider. So I guess I'm just kind of asking, I was just interested in why you were presenting that right at the beginning, because I didn't remember it in the previous version.
Yeah, that's right. But do you give us these very briefly this characterization of riots? He talks about the Idman and the Latin and the historical riots. All of them are pre-political, and it's only what he calls a historical riot, which is a riot that is connected with the idea of communism or his idea of the event, that had the potential to be pre-political, right? So I started with that because I think part of what I'm doing is precisely problematizing these accounts of the political that are, that set this framework and confidently say this count and this doesn't count as political. But it's interesting that what needs for riots to be political is that they have to occur with an idea. Those are the historical riots, the Arab Spring, for instance. But then those are pre-political. They still require something like a supplement for them to become,
Well, and again, the reason I asked.
I'm really sorry, Luis. I want to get on to.
to take it to the pub.
Okay.
Thanks.
So can I thank Herman and thank him for improvising, quite literally. What places? So Prathama, welcome. Very nice to meet you. Finally, unfortunately only in the virtual world. I'd like to welcome Prathama for the closing keynote of the conference. And Prathama, just so you're aware, we are recording, if that's okay, because then it will be used in the European network for colleagues who couldn't be with us today.
Sure.
Right. So Prathama,
And are you sure you don't want a break of 5 minutes or so? I heard that the pub is still in the future. So if you want a break, I'm okay with it, just to say, up to you.
is there anybody, because we had lunch before Herman's session, so I think we're okay.
Okay, great.
Which is great, thank you. And I'm sorry you can't see the whole room as well. We've got some colleagues online, some people in the room, but we don't actually have a camera in the which we normally have that focuses on the room. So
Don't worry, yeah.
but I'd like to welcome Prathama. For colleagues who are not aware of Prathama's work, we can turn this around, yeah. For colleagues not aware of Prathama's work, Prathama has published a number of books, but the text which I've read, and I'm afraid I have only read one, is Elementary Aspects of the Political, which forces us to radically reconceive some of the, and I'm going to just be blunt about this, some of what it is assumed in Western metaphysics constitutes the basic elements of the political. Among other things, Prathama puts into question our ideas of selfhood, of action, of equality, and of the people. I asked Prathama to speak in part because what Brighton is doing for Capano, and the project is called the Cartography of the Political Novel in Europe, is we are looking at the categories of the political insofar as these might inform how we come to understand what constitutes the political aspects of the novel. As we've already suggested, and Prathama won't have witnessed this, perhaps it's the novel that actually does work on the political that we can't always anticipate. So it's a really great pleasure for me. I'm hoping that Prathama will be a guest at the University of Brighton next year, and we'll do some workshops with Prathama about her own work. And I know that, Prathama, you have now moved on to other work that you're doing, which follows on from this. But it's a great pleasure to welcome you. We have 1.5 hours, and I'm hoping that there'll be some time for us to have a discussion as well about your work at the end. But it's fantastic. Nice to see you here. I'm now going to shut up and let you get on with the talk.
All right, thank you, Mark, and other colleagues for making me part of this conversation. And I truly apologize for not being able to participate fully in this, wonderful project, as far as I know. Today I call my presentation The Modern, the Archaic, and the Untimely. Temporalities of Radical Politics. In this, I present to you the evolution of Ranajit Guha's bilingual oeuvre as he moved from the historical to the literary in his search for common lives and subaltern politics. Guha passed away recently in his 100th year. So I thought it will be apt to pay critical homage to him in this forum on rethinking the political. Guha's most important contribution to political philosophy is not his historiography of the subaltern, which is how he is best known, but his unique phenomenology of time. Mobilizing modern and non-modern semiotic and aesthetic traditions, Guha reconvened time as a function of the limits and possibilities of human language. He argued that emancipatory politics required a radical reopening of the question of time and a stepping aside of the framework of modernity. Now, modernity primarily imagines time in two ways: as chronological succession onto which is mapped a narrative of progress, modernization, development, and transition, history, and as a series of chronological ruptures onto which is mapped a narrative of disruptive events, new beginnings, and apocalyptic reckonings, revolution. Both these imaginaries have been powerfully critiqued for their foundation in universal transition narratives, which not only tend to render the subaltern non-coeval to her own times, but also deny the reality of heterogeneous times and multiple worlds. I suggest that Guha's work offers us a way of rethinking our contemporary as an agonistic interplay of incommensurable pasts, memories, emergences, virtualities, and futures, both human and planetary. Of these, what we call the modern is only one. The task of political philosophy, then, is to face up to this intractable temporal constitution of our present. After all, this is something that other erstwhile subaltern study thinkers who have worked on South Asia have also come to argue. Most notably, Dipesh Chakrabarty in his thematization of the contradiction between global and planetary temporalities, and Partha Chatterjee in his description of the democratic present as a complex articulation of heterogeneous times. Ranajit Guha is most well known as the founder leader of the subaltern studies, a movement of radical history writing that emerged in 1980s India. Criticizing the then dominant nationalist, Marxist, and British social history schools of historiography for rendering peasants and first peoples of the colony into pre-political and pre-modern subjects of history, Guha sought to fashion a new archival method and a new representational technique that could render the subaltern present to modernity. Soon, however, his historical search for the subaltern came up against the limits of academic history, leading Guha to interrogate history's disciplinary protocols, its juridical conception of evidence, linear chronological sensibility, causal narrative structure, authoritative orientation towards the past, and its constitutive state centricity. He argued that to do justice to the subaltern, one had to imagine new expressive forms and new narrative temporalities other than that of history. this was when Guha moved from a critique of history to a phenomenological rethinking of time. Abjuring the historian's preoccupation with the representation of pasts, Guha now reconceived of time as a function of language, grammar, narrative, and expression, and turned decisively from historiography to literature and poetry. This was interestingly also when Guha seemed to disavow his global post-colonial persona and return to writing exclusively in Bengali. I suggest that by proposing to engage what Guha called the knottiness of time, K-N-O-T, the knottiness of time, Guha disavowed the modern binaries between linear and cyclical, human and natural, historical and mythological, serialized and substantive, empty and symbolic temporalities. He set out in search of a language that could co-signify the freedom and the finitude of the human condition and capture the orientation to the world that humans have come to call time. Only such a language of thought, he argued, could unchain human futures from the false promises of capitalism and modernity. In his manifesto, in the first volume of the Subaltern Studies, Guha accused modern historiography of failing to grasp the autonomous domain of radical subaltern politics. That the question of time was implicit in this understanding of subaltern autonomy became clear immediately after, when Guha went on to say that subaltern politics can be traced back to pre-colonial and non-modern traditions, which colonial modernity failed to render ineffective, unlike pre-colonial elite politics, which quickly became anachronistic with the hierarchical co-optation of elites into modern institutions of power. Guha insisted that even though these popular traditions were non-modern, they were not archaic. They were meaningful and active in the present, and in combination with colonial modern ideas and practices, these traditions produced new forms and content in 19th and 20th century popular politics. In other words, autonomous subaltern politics, according to Guha, was indubitably present and yet strangely untimely with respect to the so-called modern. That this understanding that the subaltern embodied a kind of temporal alterity to the present required Guha to experiment with representational techniques that could enunciate the play of heterogeneous temporalities at the heart of the modern. His 1983 book, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, is thus marked by an unresolved tension between the progressive time of revolutionary Marxism and the textual temporality of pre-colonial grammatological, exegetical, and aesthetic traditions. For example, Guha brought the concept of atidesa, literally the extrapolation, transference, or excess of meaning, a technical term found in Panini's classical grammar and Jaimini's Mimamsa hermeneutics, to bear upon the analysis of peasant interpretative and organizational techniques, by which insurgent consciousness made sense of abstract power relations and acquired a supra-local efficacy. Similarly, he analyzed the Manusmriti, an ancient juridical text that prescribed norms of social conduct according to hierarchies of caste and gender, to understand modern renewals of pre-existing structures of subordination. The epigraph with which elementary aspects begins, tellingly, is an extract from the 3rd century BCE Buddhist text Majjhima Nikaya, which cites the Buddha as speaking of a time when masters become slaves and slaves masters. Guha implies that these older conceptions are operative in modern day politics as live forces. This becomes even more evident when one notes that Guha not only approaches these older concepts as so many objects of analysis, but also deploys them as part of his own temporally eclectic repertoire of analytical tools, positing them as commensurate to his eminently modern object of study. Guha then went on to argue, most famously in his essay, The Prose of Counterinsurgency, that historical prose, be it colonial, nationalist, or Marxist, flattened out this temporal hybridity of contemporary lives, forcing them to fit into the narrative of historicism. Already in the 1980s, thus, Guha appears to be moving from a critique of historicism towards what the Dutch historian Ilko Runia calls a critique of representationalism. History, according to Runia, imagines the past as non-present, as absent, and hence accessible only as a representation. This produces a metaphorical relationship to the past. Metaphor being the mode in which we make sense of one thing by putting it in a horizontal relationship with another. So, history makes sense of the past by referring it to the present, and of the present by referring it to the past, producing a circularity in which the ontological status of the past itself becomes irrelevant. Runia proposes, like Guha, that the past is not absent, that it has presence not only in shards and ruins, but also in language and common sense. This present past appears in a metonymic, a part to whole relationship to our times, as an infra or a supra register of the present itself. This past is not to be read for significance or meaning, but acknowledged in terms of its efficacy to move us. Runia then goes on to criticize, as does Guha, modernity's conceit that the new and the novel are an exclusively modern invention. He shows, by invoking classical Greek rhetoric and dialectics, paralleling Guha's interest in classical Indic language philosophy, how the new is produced not ex nihilo, an Abrahamic theological idea inherited by modern revolutionary politics, but as an unprecedented third, emerging out of the chemistry between present pasts and present futures. As we know, by the late 1980s, the problem of representation had come to be openly debated in the pages of the Subaltern Studies. In her Deconstructing Historiography, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak showed up the political and ethical limits of representation and accused Guha of an untenable metaphysics of presence that founded his claim to faithfully recover and represent subaltern consciousness in the language of academic history. Instead, she offered her own reading of the Subaltern Studies project as an alternative theory of change and glossed Guha's counterintuitive readings of the historical archive as a prime instance of the literary practice of deconstruction. Interestingly, however, while Spivak urged Guha to give up on his imagination of the subaltern as an immediate historical subject, Guha's own work took a very different direction. His critique of first historicism and then history, instead of taking him from the subject to the text, returned him to a refigured aesthetic subjectivity of what I shall explain as a dispersed self in the world as prime conduit for the unfolding of being and time. This was also the moment when we see Guha shifting his attention from the event of insurgency to the everyday time of common lives. Guha's 2008 essay on a colonial city and its times described ordinary urban life in the colony as an unceasing present with neither anteriority nor futurity. He did this by contrasting the narrative temporalities of two mid-19th century realist parodies, Charles Dickens's Sketches by Boz and Kaliprashan Noshingho's Tales of the Barn Owl. Guha shows how everyday time is differently structured in metropolitan and colonial literature. In the metropolis, everyday minutiae are incorporated into the march of historical time, so that even broken backstreet lives seem to acquire a past and a future derived from the historical destiny of the globally resurgent imperial nation. In the colony, however, the unprecedented colonial present devours both the past and the future. The everyday becomes immediate, unrelenting. An argument, incidentally, that Guha had already made in a 1998 essay called conquest foretold via the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Guha's shift of attention from history to literature thus coincides with his shift of interest from the event to the everyday. Guha's everyday, however, must be distinguished from the everyday proposed by James Scott in his Weapons of the Weak, a book that made waves almost at the same time as the Subaltern Studies. While Scott's everyday was recovered ethnographically, Guha insisted that the everyday was not directly accessible to either anthropology or history. Anthropology rendered the everyday into banal habit and routine, and history subsumed the everyday under the biography of the state. Guha's 2002 book, History at the Limit of World History, was precisely an attempt to co-theorize everyday time and the literary imagination. Guha cited Henri Lefebvre's statement that the familiar deceives by redundancy, and argued that the everyday called for not painstaking detailing in a realist mode, but a special insight. To him, this special insight was to be found in the poetic and the literary. Historical facts are necessarily grasped ex post facto, Guha said. The everyday data of common weal and woe, on the other hand, are subject to the unfolding of singular lives and are therefore anticipatory and uncertain in nature, as is politics itself. In that sense, the everyday, and by implication politics, is the classic subject matter of literature. So it's no accident that history talks of development and relates to the past through the logic of causality, while literature and poetry talk of actualization of a potential that may or may not realize itself in time, as do political utopias. In other words, the everyday admits to the vicissitudes of time, while history seeks to domesticate it. In Guha's telling, European philosophical traditions worked with a fear of the corrosive capacity of time, and hence displayed an utter dependence on the state's sovereign capacity to stabilize time's vicissitudes. In Europe's origin myth, Kronos devoured his own children and had to be tamed by the sovereign power of King Zeus, a story that came to be sublimated in Hegel's idea of the state as the ultimate embodiment of the self-actualizing spirit, centering the movement of time as history. History, in turn, came to be anchored to the figure of the historian, the stable and enduring authorial self, placed above time, as it were, and acting in analogy to the state as eternal witness to time's passage. In Indic aesthetic traditions, however, Guha added, time was understood as much as a creative as a destructive force that brought the world into being. But this was the poet's function as well, which is why the term bhava, denoting poetic efficacy and also denoting the act of creating a new world, derived from the root word bhu, meaning bringing into being. Guha contrasted the European genres of history and the realist novel to the Indic poetic genres of katha and kavya to argue that while the former grounded time and truth in the stable self-identity of the author's experience in time, despite post-structuralist declarations of the death of the author, the latter privileged the listener's or the reader's initiative. In Kavya, it was the listener who incited the cycle of retellings of a heard of past, based not on the poet's access to absolute knowledge and facticity, but on a shared sense of wonder at a time recognized as not one's own. If the historian sought to establish a relationship of authority vis-à-vis the past, which is why the future appears as a fearsome other, the poet related to the past in the same way as it did to the future, as coeval to each other, through a sense of astonishment at unknown and unimaginable times. Taking the Mahabharata as the prime example of itihasa, the poetic genre concerned with the past, Guha then goes on to show how important interlocutors were in the unfolding of the narrative. Even the putative original author of the epic, the sage Vyasa, is staged as the original listener, charged by the gods with relaying the story and its many voices across time. In Itihasa, the narrator and the listener are coeval because they both partake in a shared temporal distance to the narrated event. It is this temporal alterity of both the past and the future which produces a certain wondrous openness as Itihasa's primary effective orientation towards time. Wonder being the ultimate ground of novelty, which deploys retellings and repetitions to foreground subtle but unmistakable changes in the familiar everyday. In other words, in Guha's telling, in non-historical traditions of apprehending time, between poet and audience, author and reader, the experiencing self itself appears temporally distributed, rather than as a self-identical witness entity. Now one might wonder, in what way is Guha's move from history to literature predicated on his initial quest for the subaltern? Guha seems to imply that the subaltern can only come into her own by disavowing the time of history and the modern state, which is founded on the political theology of sovereignty as a form of extratemporal perpetual power, an eternally enduring presence untroubled by insurgencies, regime changes, and temporal vicissitudes. This becomes more explicit in Guha's 2013 Bengali book, Love and Betrayal. Here, Guha thinks through the temporality of the promise, faith and fidelity as the ultimate guarantee of the future. Through a reading of the archaic stories of King Creon and his sister Antigone, and King Rama and his wife Sita, Guha argues that the promise of law as embodying perpetual sovereignty and the state guarantee of the people's future rests on a betrayal of another promise, the promise of the forever animating kinship and erotic love. Why do such stories inevitably attach themselves to the story of kingship and sovereignty? Guha asks. He says that it is the story of this other promise, always already betrayed as are Antigone and Sita, that takes us from history to poetry, from the story of foundation to that of the abyss and abandonment of the beloved in the name of the subject. Perhaps Guha is implying that we attend to the negative temporality of this betrayed promise in order to sense the subaltern via a poetics of desire and loss rather than a historicist recovery of presence. Perhaps Guha is also deconstructing the European origin myth of the state as based not on a fickle promise, but on a legally justiciable social contract between equals who are never that. In his 2009 Bengali book, The Poet's Name and Common Names, Guha goes further in elaborating the distinction between the temporal orientations of the poet and the historian. In this book, he rereads Rabindranath Tagore alongside ancient Indian thinkers Panini, Bhartrihari, and the 8th century dramaturgist Bhavabhuti, whose play, postscript to the Ramayana, focused on Rama's unwarranted exiling of Sita to the forest and his murder of the low-caste ascetic Shambhuka under pressure of majority opinion, displaying Rama's kingly failure to navigate the contrary demands of justice. Through these readings, Guha goes on to argue that the complex interplay of the first and the second person pronouns in poetry, the I and the you, undermine the contextually overdetermined subject position of the proper noun, the authorial name, the political vanguard. In poetry, Guha argues the temporality of the address and the addressee are so entangled that they often lead to unexpected exchange of positions. This unstable dynamic of the I and the you, creating uncertainty around who is speaking, when and where from, socializes the self in the world, distributes the self in the world via the aesthetic imperative of sadharanikaran, literally generalization or making common, a technical aesthetic term that Guha borrows from classical rasa theory. Sadharanikaran, making common, makes possible an overreach of the present, a move beyond historical context, and a leap into other times and other places, a poetic capacity that Tagore mobilized, Guha believed, in his critique of nationalism and his poetic embrace of not only the world, but also the cosmological. In Guha's reading, this expansive embrace of the world made possible by the poetic dispersal of the subject self is more than just a humanist orientation. In his 2009 book, Songs of the Six Seasons, Guha explores Tagore's laborious efforts at attuning human language to the Earth's seasonal mood changes, reminding us of Jane Bennett's recent quest via Henry Thoreau and Walt Whitman for a middle voice, a verb form in between the active and the passive voices that could adequately register earthly vitalities in human language. In 2010, Guha wrote an essay called The Primordial Poet and the First Reader, where he traced the origin of poetry to the ancient encounter between humans and birds. Valmiki, a reformed low-caste bandit, remorseful of the violence of his vocation, is wandering the forest when he encounters an amorous pair of birds frolicking in the trees. A hunter shoots his arrow and kills the male bird. The female bird sings out in distress, and words roll out of Valmiki's mouth as if by their own volition. It is a curse, set to meter and rhyme, which goes on to become the first poetry in the world. Guha says, I quote, "Set to human language, time becomes poetry." Earlier in 1998, Guha had published an essay on the poet Jibanananda Das's poem, The Sun and the Twine of Time. To Guha, Jibanananda juxtaposed cosmic and human images and forms in his poetry to show up their incommensurability with each other, endangering in the process the metrical, syntactical, and semiotic stability of human language itself. Guha argued that the only way to think of time and future in the human language is by intensifying this mismatch. Any attempt to align the two would be a naive, failed act of representation. Now, Guha's choice of Jibanananda is interesting. a solitary poet, very different in style from his modernist contemporaries, Jibanananda died early in 1954 under the wheels of a Calcutta tram car. He wrote of wildernesses, as much of the urban wilderness, the gutter, the hydrant, the rail track, leper colonies, dank and bold gullies, as the rural, streams, grass, weeds, roots, insects, amphibians, mud, birds. Here is an extract from his poem One Day 8 Years Ago, to give a sense of why Guha thinks with Jibanananda in his quest for a more than human linguistic orientation to time. Nevertheless, I quote the poem, nevertheless, the owl stays awake. The rotten, still frog begs 2 more seconds of warmth. In the shapeless, winged darkness, we feel the unforgiving enmity of the mosquito net. The mosquito, who loves life, buzzes around the dark human monastery. Unquote. I conclude. The evolution of Guha's thinking, as he moved from communist activism to a critique of historicism, to a disavowal of history, to a post-colonial critique of European political philosophy, empirical sociology, and realist aesthetics, to eventually a cosmopolitical stance, can indeed be read as a metonym of our times, which we often experience as an intensified and intractable present from the 1980s through to the 2020s. What I tried to do today, by way of reconstructing Guha's rather maverick journey, is offer an instance of how political thinking can learn from and evolve with changing times. I suggested via Guha's work that thinking the political at a time of quote unquote permanent crisis, spiraling inequalities, democratic authoritarianisms, resurgent racisms, technological takeovers, ecological disasters, what you will, requires us not only to interrogate the temporal concept of crisis itself, but also reopen the question of time as such and explore the thresholds of human experience. So I ask, with no answer to give, of course, how does one think the time of political action when one arrives at this threshold, indexed by technologies of automation, undeserved death and disease, extreme climate events, and democratic implosions, a threshold of human thought which challenges experience itself as the hitherto available touchstone of thinking. Guha's own preference was to do this through an exploration of the limits of human language. He also brought into play traditions and sources other than the modern in order to reconstruct unfamiliar and forgotten genealogies of thought. Guha, by the way, never really claimed to be a post-colonial or decolonial thinker, though he has often been read as such. To my mind, Guha is best understood as a prime example of a cosmopolitical quest, something that comes through more clearly if we pay attention to his late Bengali writings. I see Guha as cosmopolitical in the twin senses of the term. One, as exceeding the nation, and two, as circumscribing the human. Even though the concept of cosmopolitics was perhaps not quite available to him. If there could be the possibility of a new canon of political philosophy for our times, Guha, I feel, would certainly figure in that. Thank you very much for your patience.
Prathama, thank you very, very much. Oh, echoes. Turned off the mic. Now you can hear. Okay. So lots to think about. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm going to open up first to colleagues who are online, if there is anybody who would like to start online, but if not, we have some questions in the room to begin with. And we are operating in the strange temporality of the internet with colleagues in different spaces. Let's begin in the room then. Is there anybody who would like to start? Spiros.
Okay, thanks a lot. Very, very interesting.
Spiros, could everybody introduce themselves so Prathama knows whom she's talking to as well?
I'm Spiros Makris. I'm professor of political theory, and this period of time I'm here at the Brighton as a visiting research fellow at the University of Sussex. Very impressive talk. I'm trying, as always, to put there the big picture of every speech. And with respect to Guha, in my mind, okay, in my understanding, whatever he says sounds in my ears something as post-structural or postmodern or something like that. And we know for sure that this kind of analysis goes back to Heidegger and then to Nietzsche and then to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. And to be, okay, very precise in my analysis here, whatever he says about being, time, and language, okay, for me, these are the triangle, the conceptual triangle there, being, time, and language. It reminds me so very much whatever exactly Heidegger says, okay, you used exactly this phrase, the unfolding of being and time, if I'm not wrong. And we know for sure that Heidegger, the late Heidegger, speaks more and more about being, okay, time, and language, which is poetry. And he says exactly that being, okay, either design or the big being, okay, duels into language, and especially into poetic language, because in his mind, he has Hölderlin. So I'm wondering, what is exactly, okay, with respect to Guha, okay, if the pronunciation is right, was it the new that he brings to us, okay? Because we have Heidegger there, okay, and he has said a lot of things concerning being, time, language, poetry, and so on and so forth. This is my question, and thanks a lot.
So should I?
Of course, Prathama, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you
we've
very
got
much.
time, so we'll have a dialogue.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's quite insightful in the sense that you are right. Guha actually was greatly interested in Heidegger. So in his History at the Limit of World History, he actually works through Heidegger in some parts. However, and this might, you guys were talking about the question of translation just before I was able to join. I would actually disagree with I agree with the fact that there is a resonance in some of what Guha is saying with Heidegger's idea, imagination of being and poetic language and so on. However, some of this similarity might appear because of the way that I am translating Guha in the language of English academia, right? So when I say unfolding of time, one immediately thinks, oops, Heidegger. Now, so that's also the politics of language per se. Now, let me try to distinguish Guha's from the post-structuralist turn and from Heidegger, at least on two counts. One, Guha actually has colleagues and worked with colleagues who were strongly in part of the post-structuralist movement. Spivak being well-known one, who was the first to translate Derrida in English and so on. So clearly he's part of that world. But as I was trying to point out, Guha actually does not take the textual turn. In fact, he goes on to talk about not just the self. Once again, the self becomes, again, a kind of badly translated term about, as I was saying, the common noun. The I or the you of common, the pronoun, the pronoun, sorry, I meant to say the common pronoun, which has no name attached to it, and therefore is not self in the metaphysical sense of the term, but is really a kind of relationship of address and addressee. And in that sense, he is talking about the impossibility of a coherent self, and as political. So political. Of course, Ranajit Guha and Heidegger's politics were vastly different. That's a self-evident point that does not need belaboring. He was a Maoist and a revolutionary, and not really an academic to begin with. He was a Communist Party member and so on and so forth. And he resigns from the Communist Party only when the Soviet Union invades Hungary, and then gradually becomes an academic, and very different, therefore, from in political terms. But he is actually not speaking of being as such. The other point in which I would distinguish Guha vis-a-vis the post-structuralist turn is that Guha is actually very, very focused on the limits of language and the threshold where language fails, rather than language being the overarching paradigm of thought, meaning, action, enunciation, elocution, injunction, all that we think of in the political domain via the metaphors of language philosophy. He is actually, in a sense, a tragic thinker at the end of his life, who is struggling with the limits of human language to capture both the non-human, but also that elusive revolutionary political agent who is always there but never quite. So it's the limit question rather than the language question that is animating him. So I hope, that's somewhat clearer in terms of what I'm trying to do with Guha. Of course, some of it could very well be my Guha rather than Guha's Guha. But anyway.
Could I follow up with a question, Prathama? so because that what you just said was how I interpreted what you'd said. And I wanted to ask you about some of the places, some of the things you finished with at the end, because it bears on some of our discussions earlier today and yesterday. First of all, the circumscription of the human and the ways in which that takes place. And obviously language is one of those places in which that takes place. But also you spoke about the cosmopolis. And I was wondering about the link between a cosmopolis and the circumscription in the human, because of course in the so-called West, and I don't like the term the West, but the notion of cosmopolitanism refers to a global humanity. It's not about something that circumscribes the human or puts into question the limits of the linguistic or language as access to. And I wondered also about the ways in which that then ties back to a politics of the middle voice, which is something which I'm fascinated in, because that suspends the distinction between person and thing, subject and object. The middle voice suspends both of those as a way of beginning to think about a dispersed subjectivity. So sorry, a bit of a mishmash of a question, but I was interested in how you tie those bits of your reading of Gupta together, Guha together.
Yeah, no. I think it's a very clear question, and you're right. Once again, I am using the term cosmopolitical, and Guha is not. Apart from the fact that he is writing in Bengali, so he is using a term that is actually quite interesting. It's called, it's a term that is available in Sanskrit originally, and it's very much part of the modern vernacular languages of India. It's called Nisarga. Nisarga is translated today as nature, but actually means the propensity of things to evolve without human intervention. But it can also mean evacuation and waste and things that you do not know what to do with. Right, these are some of the archaic meanings of the term, which fall off from the term through history. The other term that Guha uses is again a term translated as nature today, nature as in the nature culture nature, Prakriti. But Prakriti is again an older philosophical term in a different binary. The binary there is not nature culture. The binary there is what is called Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti, today's nature, Prakriti actually means vital matter. Insentient vital matter, which is responsible for all sorts of evolution, mutation, individuation, transformation. So the closest I can translate it to would be materiality, vitality, something like that. The binary that Prakriti functions in is Purusha. Now, what is Purusha? Purusha is what is called the sentient, unchanging, timeless, witnessing consciousness, which can do nothing except witness. So there is no vitality, no activity, no transformation, no time in Purusha. And there is a certain gendering in this binary, by the way. The unchanging, uncreative, the pure sentience of the human cogito, as it were, in our terms, but not so in whatever, 5th century, is the male. Prakriti, the one that does everything, changes everything, is supposedly the feminine. And like the Chinese yin and yang, actually they are not binaries. They just do not function without each other. They are conjoined, as it were. And so when Guha writes, he says Prakriti, he says Nisarga, he never says cosmopolitical. I am saying cosmopolitical because I don't know what else to say. And I say cosmopolitan in English, and I say cosmopolitical not so much in the not in the kind of global humanitarian sense of the 1990s, but more perhaps in the Isabel Stenger, Donna Haraway sense of cosmopolitics without a cosmopolis. Right. So interestingly, I'm part of a project on a new collected volume on Cosmopolitical Now, where one of the most important struggles that we as editors are facing is how to transform this concept in context of the more than human and non-human turn and the technological turn, both. The interesting thing is that very often the ontological turn or the new materialist turn is thought separately from the technological turn. So there is media studies and technology studies and algorithm studies on one hand, and then there's ecology and non-human studies, animal studies, vibrant matter studies on the other. So how does one think of the cosmos by bringing the two together today? That's one of the struggles that we're facing, and it's pretty difficult because these are two very different disciplinary orientations. So I know, rambling answer too.
Could I just, Leah, do you have a question? Could I, Seraphin has a question, we'll come to him. Could I just follow up about the middle voice and literature and the turn to the aesthetic in Guha's work? And it's only, I'm being completely narcissistic. I have a long-standing interest in the middle voice, and particularly in literary practices which suspend authorial, suspend the place of the author in order to perform a form of subjectivity that is no longer singular, is not any longer about the realization of consciousness, or about the European modern narrative and its realization. So I'm just interested in your understanding of the middle voice in your reading of Guha.
I am not sure I'm not even sure he's thinking with that grammatical term, the middle voice. As far as I can make out, he is working towards a kind of undercutting of the authorial position, what he calls the proper noun. There's no doubt there. But I don't think he's thinking in terms of the middle voice, as far as I could see in his work. But I had I don't know whether you've read this new book. It's not so much about middle voice, as it were, but in terms of can one speak in other voices story, other human voices here. It's a book called it's called the Nature Book. So I'm trying to remember who it is by. I mean, it's a very recent book actually. So it's called the Nature Book, and it's a 300-page book. The entire book is a weaving together of writings of other authors from the 19th century to today, just picking up nature descriptions and weaving them together in a kind of coherent narrative. So in this, it's an editorial marvel because the book reads as completely coherent, but there is nothing that the author writes there, this particular author. So from Jane Austen to Charles Dickens to Richard Powers, the book is just a weaving of other voices. So just an example that I was very excited to see this, just an example of, both narrative and grammatical experiments. My hunch is that the middle voice in that sense does not exist in the Bengali language. I cannot be sure about Sanskrit, but it does not. So we do not, what we call the passive voice in English is very rarely used in Bengali. And it sounds quite weird. Sometimes while translating, people kind of get into that, but it sounds really weird to say that it has been said by me. It's very difficult to say that in Bengali. I think I'm kind of treading in an area which I'm not very sure of, but I'm also thinking of the work of somebody called Francois Julien, who works on Chinese texts. He's a French sinologist, as far as I know. He has a very interesting take on the different configuration of voices in the Chinese language as well. That he says that this distinction between the active and the passive does not exist in the same way in Chinese. So maybe he will have probably more things to say about this. So
we have another question from someone who, Seraphin, are you there? Great, yeah. If you could switch your camera on, Seraphin, that'd be great.
So yes, my name is Seraphin and I'm a PhD candidate at the Munich School of Philosophy. Thank you, first of all, for your interesting talk. I learned a lot today about Guha and Runia, two authors I was not so familiar with before. You asked this fascinating question, how does one think about the time of political action when one arrives at this threshold of the possible or the thinkable? And I think there might be a fitting concept in the European tradition, this difference between chronos and kairos. Like chronos is this name for normal sequential time. And also I would say the time of official history. And kairos is this moment of change, of revolution that suspends chronos. And it's this moment of the state of emergency. And this concept of suspension of this normal time is also a motive that we find, for example, in Walter Benjamin and other authors of this secular eschatology or secular messianism. So my question would be, what would be your position on these theories, given what you talked about in your lecture?
Sure. I have learned a lot from reading, of course, Walter Benjamin and François Hartung, his recent work on the distinction between chronos and kairos, and it's. However, when I say the threshold of human experience, I mean to say, and I think Guha also means to say, that it's not only about a future which is never ever fully known. It at the threshold of human experience indicates processes and events that cannot be understood in terms of experience at all, such as, for instance, atmospheric changes, which can be felt as a heat wave or an unexpected storm, but cannot be cognized accurately in the language of experience. Or, this is something that Dipesh Chakraborty pushes very hard in his book on the climate of history in the planetary age, saying that, what is happening under the ocean in the era of climate change cannot be formulated in terms of human experience, however open human experience might seek to become. Similarly, the technologies of automation in some ways, or let us say the black hole of algorithmic calculations, riding on which we are talking to each other today, is something that is actually beyond experience or cognition. It's only when that goes under the threshold of cognition that we can operate in the form of a human interface. So it's not so much about the future per se. It is also about the future, but it is as much true of the present. And this is something very different from the modernist concern of somebody like Walter Benjamin, of the ruins of the past and the angel of history type. Because here the argument is that now politics need to ask the question, how do we act in a context where we know that we are inhabiting and struggling with processes which we cannot experience and cognize only by proxy and not by perfect knowledge. You see what I mean? So that's, I think, where the push is coming from for today's politics, in my mind.
Which has a bearing on how we think the political.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
So my colleague Liam Connell, who's in the room, Liam.
Turn my camera on, but try and use the mic from the room. And apologies that I may not have fully followed the comments you were making. My discipline is literary studies, and this is part of a larger project trying to think about something called the political novel, which I don't think any of us really fully know what that is yet. But it struck me that in your examples from Guha, he tended to stray quite far from the novel, looking to Hindu epic or poetic form. And am I right in interpreting your reading of him that the novel for Guha was too bound up with a notion of history? And so I guess that if I have a question, it's whether you think it's possible to have a form of the novel that is not tied up with modernity in that very kind of European sense, or which can only capture, could there be a subaltern novel? And might that be a space where we could think about alternative, or would it have to think about alternative temporalities in order to be that thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, today, for me today, the novel has, in some senses, the real interesting thing about the new kinds of novels that are being written, especially, I don't exactly know what you are meaning by the critical novel, but I do see that what is called the some of the climate novels that have come up today, for instance, and the one that I was just mentioning, the nature book, but so many others. I mean, Overstory is, of course, the most famous one, Richard Powers' Overstory. Now, some of that is very, very clearly breaking out of the older form of prose that in a kind of mirrored the historicist prose, or mirrored in a sense of not only reproducing it, but also showing a mirror to it as a kind of reverse reflection. So the individual versus the collective, the knowingness of the future in transition narratives of progress versus the suspense novel, which does not let you know the future. So there is a certain kind of, what should we call it, supplementarity by which the novel and the history function for a long time in the modern age, as it were. But very clearly, the novel is gone somewhere else altogether today. And so I am totally with you. I think the novel is a genre with immense possibilities, though I really have to think through this, because it seems to me two things. One, what we know, in the moment of world literature, which is where all literary studies departments have gone very, in a post-colonial turn and so on and so forth. Now, world literature brings under one rubric texts that are widely called novels. For instance, what somebody's writing in 19th century in southern India, calling it a novel, because that's the term that comes with colonialism. But if you actually look at the structure of the text and its narrative force, it is anything but what would appear to be a novel, right? So the term novel then becomes indexical. All sorts of interesting textual experiments then come under that index. The thought that comes to my mind, and in a sense, a question to you then would be, at what point of internal experimentation would the very concept of the novel implode? Or will it always already stay as the master category of all sorts of interesting textual experiments? So that's one thing that strikes me. The other thing is, of course, about technology, in the sense that I feel very, very forced, and forgive me, this is clearly because I am not a literary studies person. I get relentlessly forced to think of novel and the cinema, novel and the short video, constantly together, a novel and the documentary, in a sense that I feel forced as a layperson who loves cinema and who loves reading novels all the time, I feel forced to have to think about them together, rather than do novel studies. I'm sure I'm sure all of us do. So that's the other thing that destabilizes me in some senses in my commitment or otherwise to the novel, because I'm totally unsure of what I'm doing when I'm reading novels now. You see what I mean? It's a very lay response, but perhaps.
Can I maybe follow up? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
So this morning, Mark was trying to talk about fiction, doing something to political fictions, which he saw
That's
as
right.
being kind of the elements of politics as it's understood in a Western tradition, or a kind of European tradition, and the same challenge kind of came up. Well, look, fictions are happening all over the place, so we need to kind of look, throw away the novel because TikTok or YouTube are also fictions. But it seems to me that there is still a necessary distinction to be made between those types of fictions and the type of fictions that the types of political fictions that Mark is talking about as kind of enabling a certain kind of operation of the state. And so the question then would be whether it's the novel or whether it's TikTok or Bollywood. Would those forms need to reject a certain kind of temporality or telling of a story? I mean, I've been reading as part of this project Rancière on politics and literature, and he's got that sense from Aristotle that literature is somehow better than history because it orders the story, whereas history can only tell you events as they occur. And I wonder whether actually we need neither of those. Do we need something? Do we need to try and imagine a fiction that really steps outside of that ordered temporality in order to have something that we could then call a political fiction, a political novel, rather?
Sure, yeah. No, I'm totally with you. I mean, I have no kind of clear answer, obviously, no clear response. But so I did not mean to say that the novel and the TikTok are co-evil. Actually, I wouldn't say that. I think they are different forms and different technologies. I am trying to actually say that we must attend to that. So there was one time, 1960s, when what was cinema, celluloid cinema, started off, I mean, not during the silent movies time, but afterwards when the talkies happened, it is really the translation of print fiction onto celluloid. Most movies were on books, right? No longer the case. So I'm saying that the question then is what happens in cross-media and cross-technology translations. So it's not so much about whether everything is fiction or history is better than the novel. I think those are rather deterministic and simplistic and reductionist kind of ways of putting things. But what does it mean to say that, you know, the novel is in some ways coexisting with a cinema that has divorced itself from the novel, and a short video that has taken on the task of self-expression, as it were, across social media platforms. So it's a kind of question of the contemporaneity of the novel and its others, and the possible translations or not between them. So that's, and yes, I mean, then the question, as you rightly point out, is then what is political about a political novel? Which then becomes a question not about the novel, but about what does it mean to attach, about the political, and what does it mean to attach the political to a term such as a novel? In other words, neither of the two terms remain stable when they come together, I would imagine. So that's the kind of thought that I have. Again, very vague, I understand totally.
Colleagues, are there any other questions we have from the room? Perhaps online? And if not, last chance. I have lots of questions, but I may have to email these to you, Prathama.
Absolutely, love that.
Especially about what we were talking about a moment ago, but that's... can I thank you very much for taking your evening and sacrificing your evening to our projects over here, but also to note that we will be talking about, I hope, the possibility of you coming over to the UK. So first of all, thank you.
Thank you very much. I was delighted, but yeah, it was just too last moment. I couldn't manage my day. I wish I could stay the whole day with you. I just couldn't take leave from office, and so I'm really sorry about that. But yes, we'll talk much more, hopefully, with you and other colleagues whom, I haven't really seen today. Yeah.
In complex temporalities.
I know. All right, then. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening. Yeah, which I'm going to miss.
For you.
Yeah. Bye. Take care.
Bye, Prathama.
Bye.
And colleagues, thank you. This is the end of the conference. So thank you to everybody who's participated, both online and in person. We have recorded, and I will send the recording to everybody as we finish. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I think now is the time for a drink.
Bye.
Goodbye, Sophie.